At dawn on Iren, the wheat heads breathed like a living sea. The colony's teachers said the world was named for peace because the first settlers decided to write every law in a single bound book, the Common Ledger, and to keep it on a public table made from the landing ship's heat shield. Peace isn't magic, teacher Meyer Alvarez told her homeroom, tapping that scarred wood before lessons. It's a decision you renew line by line. Her son Noah made a face about handwriting, and the class laughed, and the day felt like the thousands that had come before it. Quiet irrigation pumps, solar kites wheeling, the tiny hum of fusion stacks from the hillside utilities. Governor Layla Akoy walked the tree line with the agronomist, listening to rainfall charts and crop rotation plans. She visited the clinic where Dr. Soren Patel stitched a farmer's hand and lectured a teenager about helmet seals. Everything was ordinary. The shipyard's gantry arms in Port Concord lifted their first home-built corvette, the sort of patrol boat you build when pirates are myth and asteroids are not. In the evening, the market smelled of yeast and citrus, and street speakers played a string quartet some child's AI had helped compose. Iren was a long wager that people could be better when they remembered their promises. The ledger's first page declared 3. Do no harm you can prevent. Speak truth even when it costs. Keep your door open. They were old words in a new place, but they fit. The colony had its scuffles, its ration arguments, its teenagers who treated perimeter fences like dares, yet the custom was to bring every quarrel to the ledger and write how it would be mended. Maya told the children about Magna Carta and Reconstruction and the long arc of rights movements. She made civics sound like star navigation, charts drawn in courage and corrected by experience. On a ridge outside the capital, the veteran engineer Lin Tran checked the heliostat mirrors and thought, not for the first time, that a world could be loved the way a craftsperson loves a tool, by keeping it true. Her father had left a coast city that drowned 1 inch per year, and she had sworn her life would build more than it consumed. That vow slept inside the entire settlement. In the composting codes, the night shifts hush the way people remembered names. Their celebration that night was small, a festival of first rains, lamps strung along the canal. Children handed out sugared oranges. A group of elders danced badly and proudly. Governor Akoy read the quarterly account aloud. Births, harvest quotas, and the news that Iren's University would host its first symposium on comparative alien botany with visitors from fellow human worlds. When she finished, she bent over the ledger and added one line. We grew without forgetting why. The attack began the next morning in the sound before the sound, an atmospheric shudder like a giant spinning a coin. People looked up to see 3 white slashes peel across the blue, and many, for a blink, thought of meteorites. Then the slashes turned, breaking hard, and came down toward the spaceport, the power station, the school district. Maya's voice broke on the class intercom. She told them it was a drill because children deserved the mercy of a lie for 60 seconds. Lin Tran felt the ridge tremble and knew it was not weather. Dr. Patel yelled for triage teams. Governor Akoy reached for the emergency binder and found her hands impossibly careful, as if gentleness could keep the pages from knowing why they'd been opened. The ships settled like teardrops on the edges of town. They had the air of things that considered themselves clean. Tall figures in rippling graphite plates stepped out, firing at antennas and relay towers first, and when the comms went down they fired at people. They were the Glasswing Combine, an empire that used the language of hygiene for conquest. Their commander, Archon Vesk, scanned the oxygen readings and said, with bureaucratic boredom, "Contaminant load nominal. Commence abatement." Maya pushed children into the stairwell and counted their shoulders with her palms. Noah clung to the strap of the class emergency kit like it was a talisman. Lin killed the heliostat feeds and flagged the utility grid for emergency islanding. Soren Patel knelt by the first blast victim and worked with a steadiness that came from a lifetime of patching what should not have broken. Akoy tried a narrow beam hail anyway, Her voice reached only granite and seared air. Later, people would argue whether the Combine's doctrine was truly belief or convenient lie. They said species who altered ecosystems were pathogenic and should be cleared. The philosophy sounded like a lab report and a confession. It was a trick as old as empire. Rename your neighbors as problems and your violence as housekeeping. Maya thought of history lessons about Trail of Tears marches and ghettos walled for sanitation, the way every atrocity builds itself a science. In the ledger hall, the first responders stacked cots, and someone, no one ever learned who, dragged the ledger under the table as if to keep the promises safe. The glasswing squads hit the structure with a heat lance anyway. Pages curled, handwriting turned to smoke. Noah, fleeing with his class, looked back and saw ash lifting like pale moths. Later he would say the worst thing wasn't the sound, but how the air smelled like erased chalk. By sunset, the first day's killing was over in the core districts, and the squads moved outward to farms. Lynn's team rerouted power to the hospitals and cloaked a shelter by overloading the infrared in a mesh canopy. It worked for an hour, and that hour planted 50 people on the far side of death. Soren wrote names on his forearm with a wax pencil and told a father he had saved the daughter first because small lungs move faster toward the cliff. The man nodded and wept and pressed his brow to Soren's knuckles. Akoi ordered the last skiff to run for deep orbit with a data core and a transmitter. She looked at the hill where the ledger hall stood black and realized that civilization is not buildings, it's the stubbornness to rewrite what fire tries to erase. At midnight, the skiff punched through clouds, bleeding heat, chased by 3 white darts. 2 peeled off to kill a rescue shuttle answering a beacon from a farm. One held on until Lynn, working from the ridge, pulsed the heliostat in a pattern that blinded the dart long enough for the pilot to angle into the shadow of Iren's moon. She whispered sorry to the wounded mirrors as if they were friends. Meyer and 12 children lay flat in a culvert, listening to the metallic footfalls pass above. Noah's fingers found hers. She made herself breathe slow so he would. The skiff cleared the outer mesh. In the silence of the high dark, the transmitter sang. It carried a copy of the ledger's first page and the last 20 hours of Iren's life. It carried Soren's voice, cracked and formal. This is Iren. We are under extermination by an entity calling itself the Glasswing Combine. We do not ask for conquest or vengeance. We ask that our names be remembered and that our families be shielded. If you can come, come. If you cannot, tell the truth about us. Truth travels. Faster than light is not a cheat of physics, but a community's stubborn relay. The skiff's message hit the Helios gate relay within the day and dove toward Earth through squeezed vacuum. Somewhere under a mountain in Colorado, klaxons sounded. Someone knocked on a door that had not been knocked on in 20 years. On Iren, Maya counted children again, because you can still do something even when the world is ending. She got to 12 and started over because rituals matter when everything else is smoke. If you have never watched your city learn new colors, count yourself lucky. The Combine's beams painted the noon with ultraviolet streaks your eyes weren't built to see. Your body understood anyway, and every skin hair decided to rise. People speak of wars as if they come with drums. What came to Iren was a cleanliness that refused to admit it was murder. Archon Vesk walked among the teardrop landers, suited against the colony's pollen as if civility could be worn like glass. Abatement at 81%, droned a lieutenant. Residual vectors include subterranean shelters and agriculture nodes. Vesk approved. Proceed. Maya led her 12 through service tunnels, a glow strip trembling in her hand. She whispered the same line, feet on the line, hands on the strap. They passed murals painted by first graders, red suns with smiles, and through the cadence of her instructions she threaded history, people on foot crossing mountains, a church basement where teenagers learned to read when the law said they should not, a court that decided the law had been wrong. We inherit courage, she told them. We pay it forward in small bills. At the northern perimeter, Lin and a scratch crew rewired farm pumps to flood a ravine, buying an hour of fog. In the clinic, Soren triaged by touch and breath, then carved a small theater in the supply closet and performed a cesarean by lamplight. Governor Akoy took 3 calls in a row from district heads. The first asked for authorization to mount a counterattack with hunting drones. The second asked if it was lawful to surrender. The third cried and said his mother had fallen, and he did not know what he was supposed to do as a leader because he suddenly felt 5 years old. Akoy told the first, "Don't waste weapons we cannot spare." She told the second, "Survival is lawful." She told the third, "Leaders are 5 years old twice a day. Do what you would tell your son." When the landers targeted the ledger hall, the camera feed went white. A minute later, the hall was a low black hash on the ridgeline. Akoy closed her eyes. She had grown up on stories of cities burned and rebuilt, London, Chicago, Aleppo, and had thought the moral was resilience. Now she understood the more ancient moral. To love a thing is to accept you might have to build it again from ash and breath and the backs of friends. People who later studied the Combine argued about the sincerity of their doctrine. Pathogen theory, their white papers called it. Any species that alters nutrient cycles is a disease vector against galactic entropy. But sincerity is cheap when it licenses power. You can be devout and still be a butcher. What mattered in that hour was that the squads were efficient, the beams precise, the reinforcements timely. Cleanliness makes bureaucrats brave. Vesk's orders read like a factory checklist. He told his staff to synchronize the extermination with the arrival of combined surveyors already on approach, ready to plant crystals in the fields where children had run. At midday, the skiff's second packet reached Helio's gate and bounced toward Earth. It wasn't just names this time. It was telemetry on the beams, spectrum analysis of the lander's exhaust, and a sliver of combined signal shaping captured by a student who had sprinted to the radio lab and died with his thumb on the send key. Data is a kind of blood. It can carry life forward even when the body falls. Maya's dozen reached the freight depot where the old air filters hummed like bees. She gave them a choice because dignity needs exercise. We can hide below or try for the library and its maintenance shaft. Below is safer now. The shaft is safer later. The 12 hands pointed toward the shaft. She smiled at them like a captain saluting a crew. In the shaft, they found a janitor named Mr. Klein, whose job had been to mop until the mops burned. He said he could still open 2 doors. He kept one for himself and pushed the other at the children. "Teachers and janitors save the world or nobody does," he said, and the kids didn't understand, but Maya did, and that was enough. Soren finished the cesarean and placed the crying boy in his mother's arms. He wrote 2 more names on his forearm in tiny and precise letters so they would fit. Lin rerouted a satellite dish to serve as a mirror to a mirror to a mirror. A daisy chain of glare that blinded a combined scout as it strafed the canal bridge. Akoy authorized a convoy of cyclists to ferry insulin to the south shelter. When one came back alone with an empty bag and a broken pedal, she told him he had done enough for 10 men, and then she turned to her staff and said, "We cannot be brave all the time. We can be useful most of it." By dusk, Iren held, not safe, not intact, held. 1,000 alive in the shelters, a dozen in Maya's cotter, 2 babies born, the clinic floors sticky with something that had once been hope and would be again. Vesk ordered the final sweep for morning. "Complete abatement before agriform deployment," he said, as if a world were a kitchen counter to be wiped before setting down the bowls. Night brought a wind that smelled of iron and flowers. Maya crouched in the library's shaft and told a story about sailors steering by stars they could not reach. Navigation is faith made practical. Lin, on the ridge, fell asleep against a transformer with a wrench in her hand. Soren washed his forearm and could not bring himself to scrub the names away. Akoy sat by a dark window and recited the ledger's first 3 lines until the words felt like bone. At dawn, the Combine returned to finish the list. They found that the city gave them one more color, reflection. A ship in low orbit mirrored the sun just so, and a beam intended for a shelter hit the mirror and skipped, and in the window of that skip was a narrow corridor to the sky. From a hangar that had never housed a fighter, a patched shuttle bucked into that corridor like a trout leaping an impossible fall. It carried nothing but a larger dish and a bigger battery. It burned for the relay like a prayer that had learned calculus. When the dish's burst reached Earth, it carried, alongside spectrograms and casualty estimates, a sentence that went through the planet like current. We chose a world for peace. Someone else chose it for us. Choose with us now. In Washington, in Quito, in Nairobi, in Sydney, in the Denver Citadel, people in uniforms and people in suits stopped pretending the 20-year contingency was theoretical. They opened rooms with no names. They took seals off drawers. They woke admirals. The Denver Citadel's briefing room had the acoustics of a chapel and the energy of a storm shelter. Screens showed maps that were not allowed to exist, ship silhouettes never admitted in public budgets, and in a corner, a small live window of Iran from a weather drone, smoke drawing long calligraphy in the wind. Admiral Ruth Hale, a woman whose career had been built on the boring excellence of logistics, stood with her jaw cabled tight and her hands still. She glanced at the scroll of names crawling along the bottom of the Iran feed. Her father had taught civics. He would have called those names the principal. Assessment, Hale said. Director Lai from Intelligence spoke without hedging. The attackers identify as the Glasswing Combine. Their doctrine is pathogen abatement, genocide by antiseptic metaphor. Their visible tech tracks at parity with publicly known human systems, but the signal shaping in their beams suggests efficiencies we have not fielded openly. Our Helios Gate intercept captured harmonics that are now in weapons analysis. We anticipate follow-on strikes on other frontier colonies within weeks. General Matthews' army tapped his stylus against a sealed folder. Evacuation capacity? Insufficient, the transportation secretary answered. And they'll cut the corridors if they are competent. The Attorney General looked up from a dog-eared copy of the Charter of Kinship. We need to speak aloud what this is. Just ad bellum is satisfied. We have right authority, right intent, and just cause. We can still choose how. Hale's mouth twitched. She still believed in the American habit of adjudicating power with clauses and commas. Then we choose with both hands, she said. Protect life swiftly and do it under restraint that honors the memory we act for. She looked to the corner where an old admiral with a face like driftwood watched without blinking. Sir? Fleet Admiral Emeritus Chen lifted his chin. We built the umbrella and pretended it was a parasol. Time to stop pretending. There were words nobody had said into a live mic in 2 decades. Hale said them. Initiate Protocol Thorn. The screens changed. The quiet fleet came out of budgetary shadows. Hundreds of hulls that didn't reflect starlight when they didn't want to. The Aegis lattice around Earth and Mars spooled power into long rails buried in stone. The rod and relativity platforms aligned their geometry like someone shouldered a tool older than thunder and newer than prophecy. On Titan and in the Belt, factories with research plaques on their doors cut away their polite faces and revealed assembly lines for things that could punch daylight through a cruiser. A colonel in JAG raised a hand. Rules of engagement? It was the right question, the necessary American question. Hale did not blink. Discriminate and proportionate. Military targets only. Civilian corridors remain corridors. We are not what they call us. Record everything. Publish what we can. The law is not a muzzle, it is our flag. The Attorney General exhaled like a prayer. They briefed until the air went thin. The first phase would be to buy time. Quiet fleet cells would jump to Helios Gate, then ring Iran's precincts, blinding and blunting without revealing their full craft. Simultaneously, the lattice would run test fires into a dead system to calibrate solutions across interstellar drift. Hale pointed at the map. We are not racing them ship for ship. We are racing them for the narrative our species tells itself after. We will not write a story that teaches future children to love cruelty. She took 1 hour alone, walked the corridor to the small, unfashionable memorial where the faces and names of lost exploratory crews were etched into patient steel. She put her palm on the metal. "I wish we did not need heroes," she said to no one. "I wish logistics had been enough." When she returned, she was all edges in service of a center. In the comms theater, the Helios operators tied a dozen frequencies into a braided rope of reach. The first packet from Iren rolled across the room again. A young signal tech blinked tears onto his console. He let them fall and kept working. Hale recorded a transmission for the colonies. "Hold if you can, hide if you cannot, burn nothing you cannot regrow, draw maps from memory, we will come." She sent a second packet to alien channels with careful legal phrasing, as if in some luck-splintered universe there might be a combined officer with a conscience. Cease and desist. Identify chain of command. Acknowledge the status of civilians under universal covenants. The answer came back in static and doctrine. Helios gate glittered in the screens as space bent like glass turned on a lathe. The first quiet hulls slid out, a shape you would not notice if you weren't looking and worry you saw if you were. Captains called in their wings, Peregrine, Zephyr, Tanager, names chosen like charms. Hale permitted herself a grim smile at that. People who name their tools after birds are announcing what they intend to fly across. She briefed them in one sentence. "You are the space between the blade and the throat." She had history braided into her orders. She referenced convoys in the North Atlantic, the Berlin airlift, the voters who stood for hours in rain where ballots had been bullets a generation earlier. "Our species' best trick," she told them, "is not fire. It's keeping promises when it is most costly." Screens showed green, signatures winked into blue-black. The last thing she saw before the quiet fleet slid under the skin of the dark was the small live window from Iren, a child's hand on a teacher's sleeve. Captain Yara Kim of the stealth corvette Peregrine had spent 5 years practicing invisibility until it became a kind of ethics. "The art," she told her crew, "is to be where harm is least and help is most." The Peregrine kissed vacuum just outside Helios gate, her hull wicking radiation like an animal's fur-shedding rain. Ghost chorus, the crews called their network, the murmuring hush by which ships in quiet traded intent without bright signals. Kim felt the chorus like a second heartbeat in her neck. The combined task group translated in a prism flash 8 hours later. 12 landers and 8 escorts slotted for a finishing sweep. The task group's doctrine was tidy. Blind comms, break power, burn shelters, seed the fields with crystal starters, transmit a photograph of empty streets as proof of abatement. Kim listened to their carrier waves the way a musician listens to a hall. Harmonics skew to the blue on firing cycles, her signals officer whispered. "We can mimic their sensor noise at +4%. Kim nodded. "Then make ghosts." They began with confusion. The ghost chorus braided false asteroids into the combined sky, faint, drifting, exactly wrong in the ways that cost attention. The escorts slewed to track them. The landers compensated, their algorithms perfectly logical and perfectly misled. Kim let them waste 20 minutes mapping stones that were equations in a poet's handwriting. In the city below, Maya's dozen breathed in the shaft. Soren stilled his hands for an 8-second rest between triage waves. Lynn finally drank water and tasted metal and laughed once at the surprise of it. Phase 2, static in the bones. Kim's EW chief pulsed a math the Combine had not seen, gentle, almost kind, at the fringes of their targeting loops. The escorts lost lock, required, lost again. On the Combine flagship, a lieutenant cursed because machines that had worked since academy days now behaved like old dogs in a thunderstorm. Archon Vesk requested technical support in a tone that said he did not request things. No support came. The ghost chorus was too quiet to aim at, too present to ignore. Kim threaded a narrow beam to Helios gate. "Admiral, recommend harassment only until colony corridors are clear. They are moving to shelters at grid squares 5 and 9. Ill's reply came back spare. Harass, keep them angry, not murderous. When they commit to fire on crowded grids, cut their hands. The law was a live wire in both their throats. The choreography of restraint took more work than slaughter. They executed surgical disarm. The peregrine slewed her bow by half a degree and whispered a line of light into the combined lead escort's comms mast. No boom, no glory, just a pet-ailed ruin of antennae. Across the formation, quiet hulls did the same, snip the tongues, dull the knives. One lander spun up its beam to full, the ghost chorus sighed, and a quiet hull lanced the emitter at its hinge so that the beam spilled harmlessly into a wet marsh and boiled dragonflies that had hatched that morning. Kim winced at that. Even saved collateral is collateral. She bookmarked the coordinates for later mitigation crews. On the ground, Maya counted 12 again and realized she was counting as a spell. She told them a story about a masked dance where each performer wore two faces, and the lesson was that we are not our worst day, nor our best one. Soren's arm was a parchment of names now. He wrote smaller and smaller and did not cry because crying uses salt he needed for work. Lynn looked down the ridge and saw a lander hesitate. Machines can hesitate when people do. And she understood with bone joy that someone was buying them hours out among the cold stones. The combined tried heat next. Saturate the city's thermal signature, force the quiet to reveal themselves in contrast. Kim smiled. The AIs aboard the quiet had been trained on a century of human mistakes. They bled heat through radiator fins in slow breath, never exhaling where a sensor expected. She remembered her grandmother's kitchen after the war, how they cooked with the lights off, how steam clouded the windows only in the corners. Survival is a choreography you teach your children in recipes and rituals. One lander broke doctrine and dove for the reservoir, the sort of zeal that kills too many. Kim had already paired Peregrine with that pilot in her mind, the way a violinist chooses a hard passage to love. Take its rudder, she told her gunner. A bead of tungsten at a fraction of light speed slipped through the vacuum and through a bearing no wider than a fingernail. The lander yawed, clipped a floodlight tower, and scythed into a field where teenagers had once raced their bikes. No secondary beams fired. The shelter under the library did not flash white. Vesk, infuriated, ordered the escorts to spread and scour. He thought like a manager: widen coverage, increase throughput, meet targets. The ghost chorus wanted that. Spread enemies, make their own gaps. Kim slid Peregrine into a wedge where 3 escorts' fields of view left a blind kiss of space. She parked there, quiet as a moth between pages, and sent a crisp, "Corridors at 9 are clear. Move." On the ground, Akoi stood up from the stairwell where she'd been bracing a door and said, in a perfectly reasonable tone, "We are leaving now." The last act of the harassment was a confession disguised as data. The ghost chorus let the combine hear snippets of their own doctrine phrases reflected back at them, chopped and delayed so that the bridge crew's headsets played abatement, 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 until the words, repeated, sounded like abattoir, which is all they had ever been. Sometimes ethics is simply refusing euphemism, it's narcotic. 36 hours after quiet arrived, Iren still bled, but its heart pumped. 1,000 and more alive. Children blinking in clean air for the first time in 2 days. The clinic moved to a warehouse where the roof could take rain. The ledger was ash, but someone found the brass title plate and wiped it with a sleeve until the letters could be read. Lynn carried it like a relic and set it beside the door where people queued to donate blood. Hale brought the main force to Helio's gate, like a tide you could set your watch by. She spoke once to the ghost chorus, voice low enough to be a hand on a shoulder. "You have done the hardest thing, kept knives sheathed except where they must sing. Fall back one grid, the umbrella opens." In orbit, the Aegis lattice through a geometry nobody had ever witnessed. The rods woke in their stone cradles. Numbers became a promise made of speed. On the combined flagship, Vesk at last felt something like doubt, that tiny, valuable heresy. It came too late to save him or his doctrine. The first Aegis strike would make history books and courtrooms and lullabies. The ghost chorus parted like curtains to let it through. Iren's sky would learn one more color, the color of a world defended not by hate but by a vow. It began as a line too straight to be natural, a silver stitch thrown across the morning, the Aegis lattice solving for distance and drift, then caching the solution in metal at a fraction of light. The beam a combined lander meant for a shelter met that stitch and became math's confession. In orbit, escort hulls tried to turn a doctrine into a geometry problem and lost both. On Peregrine, Captain Yara Kim said nothing at first. Good tools make their own introductions. Spires of vapor climbed where rods met atmosphere, harmless where quiet had cut emitters, lethal where the calculus demanded. The first strike broke the wrist of the combined formation, took the lead escorts targeting brain apart like a watch, and the second strike pressed two landers flat without touching the creche under the library. In the culvert, Meyer Alvarez felt the air jump and knew with a teacher's clarity that somewhere a test had been aced. Archon Vesk stared at his boards as if disdain could change physics. "Counter battery," he snapped, and his officers, schooled in certainty, flung power at ghosts. The Aegis did not answer anger, it answered coordinates. Quiet hulls threaded their minimal signatures between landers like hair through a needle's eye, snipping calm masts, unseating gyros, kissing reactor housings with just enough heat to make a cautious computer choose safety over zeal. Governor Akoy stood in the stairwell and listened to how the city learned the new color. Not green, not glass, not blood, but kept promise. She looked at the brass title plate of the ledger, rescued, soot-smudged on Lin Tran's hip, and said to the room and the air and the name of the colony, "We are not erased." Soren Patel found himself with 90 seconds of quiet between triage waves and used it to write smaller, to give 3 more names a home on skin. He caught his reflection in a polished tray, red around the eyes, ash in his hair. He willed the picture into memory. "Later," he told his face. "I will grieve you later." Vesk's last clean emitter slewed toward the clinic district. Kim felt the intent in the way the escort yawed and cut it with a tungsten syllable. Somewhere in the combined flagship, a lieutenant hissed through his teeth at a bearing failure he did not know a human could find. Kim's gunnery chief muttered a thanks he didn't dare make into prayer. The crew's voices, low and exact, braided into something like him. At Helio's gate, Admiral Ruth Hale watched traces fade from hostile red to yellow to gray. "Hold fire unless they reach civilian heat," she told Aegis. "Let quiet take their sight and hands. It is harder to be gentle with a sword than to swing it." Her staff saw the effort in the way Hale's fingers pressed crescent moons into her own palm. She asked for casualty projections, corridor status, fuel for the relief birds, then took a breath she would not remember taking. The decisive move was oddly small, a patch of silence on a combined carrier wave timed like a beat in a piece of music. The ghost chorus laid that rest into the measure, a dozen combined subsystems, awaiting a heartbeat to confirm a fire solution, heard nothing and defaulted to safe. Quiet used the pause to pluck thrusters one by one. A lander found itself yawing at a schoolyard mural. Instead of beam, it gave off a confused whine like a kettle deciding not to boil. Vesk demanded a retreat vector. His navigators handed him clean math that would have worked in any sky but this one. When the flagship tried to jump, Quiet seized its hand, not to break it, but to hold it still. Aegis placed a rod, neat as a period, on the flagship's dorsal heat exchanger. Alarms howled. Doctrine looked briefly like doubt. Vesk found himself thinking of a room he had once stood in as a boy, a museum where a crystal was kept behind glass, and for a breath he understood he was the glass and the crystal both. Hale opened a channel in a comm that would later be misread as cold. "Glasswing Commander, this is Admiral Ruth Hale, United Human Defense. You are outgunned and outflown. Cease fire. Shut down emitters. Power down landers. Acknowledge that civilians are outside your target set, or you will be made unable to choose at all." The reply was doctrine. It always is right before it isn't. Vesk intoned abatement, and in his mouth the clinical syllables sounded ragged. He ordered one last sweep to prove to himself that a line written on a chalkboard outranked a vow written on a ledger. A quiet hull cut the tar-getter like a teacher snapping a pointer across her knee. 2 landers grounded and powered down, 4 more drifted and then snowed debris like contrition. "Status," Hale said. The answers came as a litany. Corridors green, shelters intact, clinic relocating, waterworks hot but holding, ledger plate recovered. The last made her close her eyes. She thought of charters and ballots and little hands learning to write. "Then we are done here," she said, and meant only the first chapter. The peregrine eased above the city until its shadow passed over the culvert where Maya's dozen blinked at daylight. Kim broke radio silence long enough to speak a sentence to a teacher she'd never met. "Keep your hand on the strap," she said, voice like a smile. On the ridge, Lin Tran leaned her forehead against warm metal and told the heliostats they had done good work. That night, Iren's sky showed a color it had kept for emergencies, stars seen through clean air. No beam, no smoke, just the steady geometry by which sailors and civilizations keep their course. Akoi took the ledger plate and set it on a table of raw pine. She drew 3 lines beneath the first 3 promises and under them wrote a 4th. "Shield the vulnerable, even from our rage." Hale's broadcast went wide, translated into half the trade sphere and the handful of alien tongues in which a human could ask for conscience without more war. "We will come for the authors of extermination," she said, "but we will not become them." The aegis spooled down. The quiet drifted outward like breath released. Archon Vesk, blinded and adrift, had time to hear his doctrine spoken back to him with the word it had always concealed. Abbot War. They named the campaign Covenant because someone in planning had a sense of history and someone in legal had a spine. The orders were precise. Seize command nodes, rescue captives, shatter the capacity for genocide. But write every strike like it would be read aloud to the dead and the living. The quiet took point. The line fleet followed like a courthouse behind a badge. Kim's peregrine hunted at the margins of combined space, not for glory, but for routes. She cut slave signal relays that turned work camps into algorithms. She mapped how abatement moved from white paper to white fire. At Vera 3, a rocky world that had been forced into sterilized grid farms, her crew found 1,000 bone charms hung from the fence. "Catalog them," Kim said, and her science officer did because the law needs evidence and the heart needs names. In the first week, the quiet took 6 nodes without a bright kill. They pinched neural nets until they yielded, trapped flagships in geometry, forced proud destroyers to power down like men who finally hear a quieter voice. Where combined garrisons fired into crowds, the aegis answered with rods that amputated weapon rooms and left mess halls untouched. Hale's staff recorded every engagement with time stamps and quoted lore in the margins. "Publish," she told comms, and the feeds went out. Before and after photos of camps unbolted, beacons for evac corridors, combined officers reading charges in clear audio before they were led away. "If we fight in the light," Hale told a skeptical colonel, "some will follow it." On Talith Station, a combined prefect tried an old trick, intermixed civilians with weapon batteries. Hale vetoed the strike. "We are not bargaining with our soul," she said. The quiet went in close instead. Peregrine docked like a whisper. Kim and a boarding team in soft armor walked a corridor where the floor had been polished thin. They cut power to the batteries, tripped doors, and stood between evacuees and an officer who said the word vector like an insult. "Names," Kim told him. "You will give me your name so a court may recognize you." It was not perfect. It never is. In a dust town on Kesh, a panicked crowd trampled a boy. Soren Patel, flown in on a relief shuttle, pressed to his sternum and counted ribs and cried in frustration at physics. He wrote the boy's name on his arm in letters larger than usual so he could not pretend he had not seen him. Meyer Alvarez turned her classroom into a field school in the warehouse clinic. Civics on crates, history on the backs of packaging. She taught the children to read the movement of a convoy as narrative, who guards, who guides, who eats last. Just war is not a slogan, she told them. It's a set of breaks. She drew Venn diagrams on cardboard. Necessary overlapped with lawful, effective overlapped with moral, and in the almond-shaped lens she wrote choice. Noah raised his hand. What if breaks break? Then you drag your shoes, she said, and the room chuckled through tears. Lin Tran rode a repair tug called Custodian across the scarred city and then farther, volunteering to teach alien towns how to make a grid that could survive both weather and malice. She explained load shedding in terms of parties and pie, how you share when the lights flicker. We don't only build walls, she told a skeptical miner at Vera 3. We build habits. Archon Vesk did not die at Iren. The Quiet nursed his crippled flagship into a corridor and pinned it there like a bad idea on a cork board. He was flown under guard to an old courthouse in Quito because Hale believed places matter. The charges read in a clear voice in a room with good air. Extermination, medical charade, conspiracy to cloak murder in laboratory language. Vesk tried to speak doctrine and found that in that acoustics, the words had the squeak of shoes on polished wood. The hardest fight of Covenant came at Myrene Gate, where the Combine had layered their signal nets 10 deep and hired a spire-alarmed hegemony to stand in front like bouncers. Hale sent messengers under flag to the hegemony commanders. Footage of camps, translations of orders, scans of sterilized orchards. Leave, she said, or stand and be counted with the authors. Half their line burned their contracts and slid sideways out of the fight. The rest stayed. Quiet made them blind. Aegis made them deaf. The line fleet made them choose between pride and survival. Enough chose survival to save lives. A pattern emerged. Where Hale's rules held, collateral fell. Where a captain cut corners, the report went up, and the next morning that captain briefed his own crew on the law with dignity and sometimes shame. Hale relieved 2 officers in a week and wrote them letters that cited both their failures and their previous good service. She told the staff to build a justice annex, prosecutors, defense, translators, trauma counselors, archivists. If we are strong enough to win, she said, we are strong enough to be fair. The campaign ended not in climactic fire, but in tired doors opening, camps unlocked, clinics stocked. The doctrine that had called people vectors collapsed into memoranda prefaced with the loser's favorite words. In light of new facts, Hale did not gloat. She signed a stack of extraditions and then walked to a window and watched children kick a ball between pallets. She remembered her father's civics class and thought, if we are lucky, they will grow up and find all this boring. They held the trials in Quito and Nairobi and a station over Ceres so that law would feel like a constellation, not a single lighthouse. The courtrooms were deliberately ordinary, wood worn by elbows, microphones with little green lights, pitchers of water left sweating on council tables. The first defendant was a combined biocrat whose hands shook only when they were empty. The charge sheet did not say evil. It said policy. Design, deployment. Meyer Alvarez watched by stream with her class, pausing to explain every dull word that made the world possible. She told them about Nuremberg and Kigali and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and then she told them about school boards and city councils because drama is not the only hinge of history. Justice, she said, is process done when we're angry. The prosecutors did not show charnel pits. They showed memos. Increase abatement throughput by 13%. They showed emails in which a junior analyst asked a question about covenants and was told to keep to her lane. They showed budget lines where the word efficiency sat on top of salted field. A combined statistician tried to argue that his graphs had never touched a trigger. The court showed the supply chain that ran from his desk to a beam and back to a ledger turned to ash. The judge, an old woman with laugh lines that grief had not erased, said, "We are not trying your motives, we are trying your choices." Archon Vesk came last. He asked for a mask to cover the ruin of his pride. The court refused. He asked for a doctrine to stand between him and the names on Soren's arm. The doctrine failed. Hale testified for the prosecution and on cross for the defense, as to restraint, as to corridors held, as to orders she had rescinded when a target proved too tangled with Holmes. The defense counsel, appointed and fierce, argued that Vesk had acted under an imperial charter in a galaxy that had not yet agreed on law. The judge nodded. "We are agreeing now," she said, and read the verdict in a voice that made a gavel unnecessary. Sentences varied. Not all were cages. Some were work, dismantling the very nets they had strung, while wearers of old uniforms, in new clothes, learned to repair what they had broken. The biocrat with the shaking hands now steadied them by holding ladders for electricians on Vera 3. The statistician ran a clinic's inventory with exquisite honesty. Vesk would never breathe free air again. He was given books and a window and the duty to read the names in the archive aloud every morning at 9. On Iren, the ledger table returned to the ridge. The brass plate went down first. Governor Akoi stood with a pen older than the colony. Lin had polished and oiled its feed like it might be a circuit. Soren stood beside the blood donor Q, clean forearms at last, the names transcribed into the book of remembrance. Maya came with her class, older now by a season, each child holding a scrap of paper. Noah had written 3 words: "We stayed open." The first new laws were small and hard. How to appoint guardians for children whose guardians had been turned to ash, which corners of the city would be gardens again and which would be left as scars you visit on purpose. What to do with the field where a lander fell and boiled dragonflies. Lin asked for a wetland there, and the council said yes. They wrote a blackout clause that required every home to keep water and candles, not from fear but from humility. They wrote an honors code for the market. No price doubles when corridors are busy. They wrote a corridors covenant. Human and alien ships could fly marked lanes without interdiction even in war. Hale came to the ridge without ceremony. She put her hand on the table and did not sit. "I brought something," she said, and took from her pocket a folded photocopy of a page her father had used in civics, the one with the preamble and the rumpled margins. "My country's charter begins with the audacity of we the people," she said. "We have learned again that we must be wider than we think." She offered the page. Akoi folded it into the ledger like a cousin you'd been too long away from. They argued, of course they argued, about memorials and budgets and whether to teach children the word abattoir. Meyer argued no, teach euphemism and how to break it with better words. Noah said he wanted to learn the names of the stars used in navigation instead. Soren argued that grief should have a calendar so joy could make appointments. Lin argued that the mirrors deserved new skins and new algorithms so they'd blind beams better without boiling dragonflies. They voted, they compromised. They ate bread together afterward because rule of law tastes like yeast and salt and the relief of sleep. In Keto, the last verdict read and the gavel fell like a leaf, not a hammer. Hale stepped away from the microphones and told her staff, "Shut 2 factories, turn 1 quiet ship into a hospital, publish a boring white paper on corridors." The war's end would be measured not in banners, but in the number of days in a row children forgot to be afraid of noon. Years slid past the way healthy years do, with days that repeat and deepen instead of recur like wounds. Iren's canal lamps came back, hung higher this time with small photovoltaic fronds that drank sun and gave back night. The wetland where the lander fell glittered with dragonflies. Lin Tran, knee-deep and grinning, counted species with schoolkids while a memorial plaque the size of a hand whispered, "Here we chose the harder thing." Meyer Alvarez taught a unit called Making Promises. She asked her students to bring family pledges from home and write them in the ledger's appendix. "I will check on Mr. Klein every Friday. I will plant an extra row and share the harvest. I will not call fear courage when it isn't." She paired those with older oaths sworn on courthouse steps, ship decks, kitchen tables. She wanted them to understand that civilization is a chorus, not a solo, and the chorus stays in tune by singing often. Noah, taller now, asked to apprentice on custodian with Lin. "I want to fix things that break before they break," he said, and Lynn laughed that bright laugh that makes adults cry in private. She gave him a wrench and a spreadsheet and a lecture about torque like a sermon about restraint. Soren Pytel started a clinic archive called after photos of scars and the lives grown around them. He traveled twice to Vera 3 and once to a hegemony township where a captain had put down his contract rather than fire into a crowd. He returned with a habit of setting 2 cups when he made tea, in case a neighbor needed one. His forearms were clear now. The names lived in the book and in the way he counted heartbeats, measured, stubborn, faithful. Governor Akoy won re-election on a platform that sounded unromantic and saved lives. Redundancy, training, wetland credits, the corridors covenant written into interlocal law with alien signatories who came to town and practiced handshakes with awkward tenderness. She lost 1 vote on a budget line and walked home with her head up. In the market, a fruit seller pressed a pear into her palm the way you pass a candle. Admiral Ruth Hale retired into the small anonymity she'd never really left. In a folded letter she left with her staff, she wrote, "Power insists it is the point. It isn't. The point is the promise power keeps or refuses to keep." She took a class once a month at a community college, the dullest and noblest topics, auditing, chain of custody, maintenance schedules. Students gossiped that she could still call rods from stone with a blink. She grinned and taught them how to balance a ledger instead. The glasswing combined did not vanish. Institutions rarely do. What they became under watch and treaty was something less proud and therefore safer. Laboratories with windows, policies that had to pass through courts. Schools where a word as small as we was taught with pictures of faces, human and not. Vesk read the names at 9 each morning until his voice roughened into a kindness he had not earned. On the day he died, an orderly closed the window and left it clean. Every year on the week the sky learned new colors. Iren held a fair and a vigil. The fair was loud with kites and soft with violins. The vigil was long and patient and ended with children chalking stars on the canal walk. The ledger sat on its table with a ribbon for a bookmark. People came by to add a line, repair schedules, new rights for rivers, a list of the 10 most beautiful words anyone heard that year. On the last page of a given year, there was always room, by law, for a line written by a child. The year Noah turned 16, he wrote, "Keep your door open, but install a hinge that will hold." The galaxy remembered Iren as both tragedy and lesson, and finally, as habit. Convoys moved in marked corridors unmolested by species who had learned by watching trials that the boring work of mercy had teeth. Quiet ships hid again because that is their art. One of them docked at Iren every spring to accept wreaths and cookies and to deliver a crate of blank notebooks stamped with the seal of the court. "For your ledgers," the quartermaster said, embarrassed by the gratitude. Meyer ended her unit with a field trip to the ridge. She set the book before her class. "What color is a kept promise?" she asked. The children argued, blue like morning, gold like bread, clear like water. The green of a traffic light when the crosswalk shows a walking person. She let them choose all the answers because education is also restraint. Leaving room for someone else's truth to stand next to yours without needing to push. As dusk braided the lamps with the first stars, Admiral Hale, just Ruth today in a sweater with a frayed cuff, walked up the path. She did not speak. She placed a small photograph on the ledger's edge, a classroom her father had kept in another century, a list of classroom rules on the wall written in a kid's uneven print. "Share, wait your turn, don't hit, tell the truth, clean up." She looked at Maya and Lynn and Soren and Akoy and the children and said, "It scales." Somewhere far from Iren, a quiet hull drifted through dark that belonged to no one. Its pilot hummed a hymn and watched the Aegis sleep. On the wetland, dragonflies stitched the air together and did not mind that they were descended from a moment when math saved them. In the market, a hand-lettered sign above the bakery read, "We open early. We stay open." The last line in the ledger that night belonged to a child with steady script. "We are the book we leave open."